Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like 20th Century Man and Ultimates, as well as the upcoming Assorted Crisis Events and Absolute Martian Manhunter, as well as an upcoming Zdarsky Comics News cover model. It's Deniz Camp. Thanks for coming on, Deniz.
Thanks for having me. It was such an honor to particularly be the cover model for Zdarsky News. Incredible.
I saw that in Chip's newsletter, and I was like, I have to mention that in my intro. You're one of like 8 cover models, so that's a rare thing.
It's truly beautiful and rare. He emailed me and out of the blue, and I was so honored to be drawn by Chip. Amazing. What a bucket list thing done.
Do you just respond to it with "Draw me like your French girls"?
Yes, I responded as quickly as I could to try to get in there before anybody else could take it away from me, and it was wonderful.
I love it. Well, besides the Zdarsky comic news of it all, how's the day starting for you?
It's good. I woke up, wrote a little bit of Ultimates, and actually our door broke, so I took apart our door for a couple of hours, and that was frustrating, incredibly frustrating. So I'm coming in with a lot of frustrated energy, just so you know.
Oh, no, that's a terrible place to start. I do think it's funny, though, because in our minds, I think that like readers of comics are like, okay, writers will go and they'll sit down and they're just going to work. They're just like, today is an Ultimates day. It's going to be clean. It's just going to be, I'm writing Ultimates. But then in reality, it's like, I'm fixing a door because life comes up. And I think it's funny how that, I mean, of course, that's how any job happens, right? Is like something comes up, you do that instead. But I think in our heads as comic fans, it's just like there's this pure creativity to it. Sometimes it's just a door day.
Yeah, I mean, as a writer as well, or as an aspiring comic book writer as well, I thought my dream, and my dream still is, to be in a room alone for 10 hours or 12 hours a day and just write constantly with earplugs in my ears and blinders on my eyes like a horse. That's the perfect situation for me. But it's just not possible. Actually, one of the big things you realize is you get into this gig and maybe something of interest to people who want to become writers is a lot of it is you become a business at a certain point. Like if you reach a certain level of success, you become a business, and so you're dealing with emails and solicits and such, and all these like micro decisions that don't seem like a big deal, don't seem like it would take a lot of time, but actually they take up a large chunk of your time. And I don't think I knew that going in, and it's not the part of the job that I like the most, but it is something that if you care about the end result a lot, like you kind of have to get into the details a lot too. So it's just part of the job, I guess.
I'm sure you've experienced this, but with a lot of job descriptions at the bottom, it'll say other jobs as assigned. And being a comic creator has a lot of other jobs as assigned, because it's not just like the business side. I mean, I've had people tell me if you're doing an image book like Assorted Crisis Events, you're not just writing it or drawing it or coloring it or whatever. You're a small business owner.
Exactly.
And you're operating in like a much larger level than you would be on, Ultimates, where it's like you write the script and you have input in all these other things. But at the same time, at the end of the day, it's just like, you're stepping in for that job. But then the other thing too that I think people forget too is like something like Assorted Crisis Events does not happen in a vacuum. You probably, even beyond the writing of it all, you probably have all these like dominoes you're pushing over because you need something to happen 2 years from now or 3 years from now or something like that. And I think that's the thing people forget about in the schedule is like, sure, it'd be great to be in your like room with leather bound books and like the most amazing writing chair and desk you've ever seen. But a lot of times it's just shooting emails being like, do you want to work on this with me?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we've been working on Assorted Crisis Events for a lot of years. That was just getting schedules straight with the artist and the colorist Jordy, and Hassan is a close friend, so he'll work when I ask him to. But it took a long time for everyone's schedules to align and for us to be ready to publish, and we delayed the book quite a lot to make sure that everything was as high quality as we could get it. But then you also have to get your variant covers, and if you want people who you really appreciate and love to do it, and that all those people are very busy. So and then once it comes out, you have to do press and you have to do a con circuit if you want it to survive, which is again something I did not realize, and 20th Century Men did not go longer than it went. I think in part because I didn't realize sort of the back end stuff you have to do to make an image book in particular survive.
Yeah. Really random question. Do you remember that we met before?
Maybe.
We met at Emerald City Comic Con on the con circuit completely randomly. I don't remember whose table it was. I just remember it was like shortly after Panel by Panel started. And I was like,
Oh, nice.
I know you.
Oh, yeah, I do remember. And I remember talking about Panel by Panel. Yes.
Yeah. I remember, I just remember being like, oh, that was nice randomly seeing him. I didn't even know you were there. And all of a sudden, and that's the thing about cons too. It's kind of like with the workday. You never know who you're going to run into.
Yeah, that's the fun thing, right? Like you're never sure, and you can meet, you run into your heroes sometimes, or your enemies. As the case may be. But I have yet to see Hassan at a con, but if I do, I'll run the other way for sure.
You've met him in person, I'm sure, right?
Yeah. He stayed at my house and things. We met him a bunch in person, but not at conventions. He just comes to visit New York sometimes, and I don't really go to the UK that often. So
my wife and I ran into him at New York Comic Con, like right as the first day was starting, and into him and his wife.
Yes.
And it was the first time I met him in person.
At the time, his girlfriend, yeah, or it's just his partner, yeah.
I was absolutely stunned by how tall he was, but I'm also very tall. So I think we were both like, wait, what?
He was staying at my house. He was crashing at my place.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, before we get into the work itself, I want to talk a little bit about your background with comics. And you have one of my favorite origins. There's like a genre, a phylum, a type of origin story that you belong to, which is you are a Barnes and Noble kid, from what I understand.
Oh, yes. Big time.
A lot of your reading happened when you would be dropped off at Barnes & Noble, where you would read comics for hours on end. I was a Borders kid. I don't know if you ever went to a Borders.
I lived in Ann Arbor, which is where Borders started. That was where I went to undergrad. So I love Borders.
Okay. Good. I thought we were part of rival gangs entirely. So that makes it a little bit better. But I'm curious, what were those experiences like? Were you just like reading anything you could get a hold of, basically?
Yeah, anything that was in trade, basically, right? Because Barnes & Noble's had I wouldn't say like extensive, but a reasonable trade selection. So I would sit down and I would read whatever there was. I had characters that I liked. I like Superman. I like Batman. I liked a lot of those characters. And I remember vividly not understanding really that writers wrote them and artists drew them. I was still associating whether I enjoyed something or not with the characters themselves, which I think is a normal kind of a progression. Is you start kind of thinking I like Superman, I like Justice League, whatever, and then you kind of realize, no, I like this person writing the book. I like this person drawing the book. And so when I first started reading, I would just read whatever. And I read Clandestine, and I didn't understand really anything that was going on, because I read Watchmen, and I was like, all right, this is pretty good. And then I would read Justice League stuff because I like the DC superheroes a lot. And I was like, oh, Justice League is the best comic. That's just those are the best characters. I enjoy those the most. And then after a while, I realized some of these are not as good as others. Like, actually, what I'm really responding to are the ones that have Grant Morrison's name on the cover,
right.
And so that was, and I really like Howard Porter's art on those books too. And that was kind of my first understanding that what I liked were these particular authors, Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, stuff like that. But I would really read whatever they had. I didn't have access to single issues. My parents weren't really fans of comics. They wanted me to read, and I'm using quotes here, real books.
Right.
So at home, I would read like the classics or what have you. And then but my mom would drop me off at Barnes & Noble's for like 8 hours at a time, or like 9 hours, when I was 10 years old or whatever. And I would just, they didn't say anything, which was beautiful. They had those beautiful couches, and I would just sit and read, and it was wonderful.
Borders had actually, in Alaska, had a pretty great selection. And I remember I was probably like 16, and I was going through all these books, and I was like, I'm going to read this one. And it was The Filth. And I was like, I don't think I'm ready for this one. I don't know if I'm ready for this one. I've watched a lot of stuff and read a lot of stuff, and I was like, I feel like I'm ready for anything. And I got to that. I was like, nope, I don't know if I'm ready for this one.
That's not entry-level Morrison, for sure.
No, it was not. I mean, to be honest, at that point, I'd been reading JLA already, because I was a Wizard magazine kid. They were hyping that up like crazy. They're like, the White Martians, you got to read this, yada, yada, yada. Yeah. And I jumped on with the second arc. And I'd read that JLA was that one that did it for you, where you kind of realized that this is who I like. It's not just, I like Zariel. It's that I like Grant Morrison and Howard Porter. I'm not going to lie, that actually made a lot of sense to me. That felt like, I don't want to say that it's like a textbook for you, but when I think about Ultimates, and even when I think about, to a much lesser degree, 20th Century Men, I kind of felt like I could see the architecture maybe that JLA run kind of created in your brain to some degree.
For sure. I think especially with my mainstream superhero work, I mean, Children of the Vault and Ultimates. I think, it's not that even JLA is my favorite thing that Morrison did or even close, but I think it was my entry point. And I think in terms of like mainstream team stuff and just, mainstream superheroes, it's some of the best that's ever done. I think a lot of people cite Authority and the first Ultimates, but I think, Morrison, and I say this all the time, but Morrison created this thing called momentism, or at least was the first practitioner that I noticed where the structure of the issues were largely building towards or focused on a specific character doing something really kind of amazing and cool, and building up to that, and the poetry of that, and whether it's the Infinite Mass Punch or Batman taking out the fire, with the White Martians and taking out the flame, or whatever it is, and then Authority and Ultimates. And even a lot of Jeff Johns' later or stuff kind of took that and ran with it. But I felt that was still, for me, the best version of that. That was filled with ideas and filled with wonderful character moments that kind of made you understand why these characters were cool. And even if you never saw them again, like Zor-El didn't get a ton of play, but I love Zor-El. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, he's an angel. He's a guardian angel. It's super cool. And I had no idea that he was only there because Morrison wasn't allowed to use Hawkman.
I didn't even know that until right now. That's amazing.
Yeah. But, a lot of really great stuff in comics comes just because they tell you can't do this, or through mistakes that you then kind of fix.
I mean, you mentioned Watchmen earlier. That's textbook.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly.
That is interesting. This is a tangent. We probably shouldn't go down it. Whatever. I'm going to do it anyways. I do think that that's an interesting thing, because like one of the questions I ask myself is like, I wonder what restrictions you have on you when you're doing Ultimates, as if like this new universe is going to have so many restrictions. I mean, you can't just like, I'm bringing the maker back right now. That's probably like the one you can't do. But when you're writing superhero comics, there's two things to it. It's like, I think sometimes people think about like, it is such a bummer that you can't do certain things. But also sometimes I think creatively, and I've talked about this on the podcast a number of times, but I think creatively restrictions can be a fertile thing because it pushes you in a direction that no one would expect, possibly even yourself.
100%. I think a lot of great art is created because of artificially imposed restrictions, or self-imposed restrictions. So for instance, Watchmen is not just the charlatan characters, but it's also the 9 grid, right? And what can we do with this thing that we're choosing to impose on ourselves? And there's the
palindromic issue.
Yes, exactly. So all of that stuff is like, you decide to do that, and then within the structure that you've set for yourself, you have to come up with all these solutions. And there's a school of writers, Oulipo, I never know how to pronounce it, but Oulipo, and they write prose, and there's also a comic version of them, and they refer to themselves as the rats who build the maze that they then have to escape. And I think that's very much a fun way of doing comics, and in particular because in single issues you can do, single issues are a unit. You don't have to restrict yourself to, say, a 9 grid for 12 issues. You can restrict yourself to a 9 grid for an issue and kind of just try to figure that out and try to make it as good as you can. And that's actually, not to get ahead of ourselves, but that's a lot of what Assorted Crisis Events is setting yourself kind of a thing and saying, okay, well, how can I play with this? What can I do with this? How can I make it interesting? So,
having read the first issues, I can tell. One of my favorite examples of what you're talking about, though, is I've brought this up on the podcast a few times before, too, but Mark Waid came on here and he said that sometimes, I think it was either this or an interview I did with him about Impulse, but basically the gist is he would write cliffhangers without knowing how he was going to get himself out of it.
I've heard him say that, which is scary. You have to kind of trust yourself that you're going to be able to figure it out, but I can see it because you don't want to necessarily telegraph what you're doing, like if you know what you're going to do afterwards, then maybe it comes out in the work and then it becomes really predictable. So
yeah, you went to school for cellular molecular biology.
Yeah, that was my major.
Yeah, and you went to medical school before doing medical work abroad after that, where you lived in places like a small fishing village in Ecuador and Buenos Aires and Istanbul.
Yeah,
I'm curious as to how moving around a lot and experiencing different cultures and communities shaped your worldview and your voice as a storyteller, because I think you can see that in your work. I mean, even particularly Ultimates, like you bring a different flavor to the work in a lot of ways. There's an empathy to your work that I think is like really important there. Do you think that affected how you approach comic storytelling?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, traveling was part of it, but even before the traveling, my father's Turkish, my mother's from the Philippines. I was raised in the States, but we would go back every summer to one of those two places, plus traveling to Europe because my parents had friends there, whatever. So one, I could see how something that you see repeatedly in my work is the importance of perspective and how people can be justified and beautiful in their own eyes and think and perceive something and perceive it in one way and another person can perceive it in another way and neither of them is really right. And that often leads to conflict or friction or whatever. That lack of understanding, that lack of being able to see things in the other's way leads to friction and conflict. And so that was a lesson I learned very early on from my parents. I was able to see both of their perspectives and also to see the American perspective there was always this distance between me and a lot of the people around me because I was raised in the States, but I did not have the background that other people did. My parents didn't teach me the same things that their parents did. They didn't, we didn't have quite that same cultural connect. It wasn't natural for me. And so trying to figure them out and trying to figure my parents out and trying to figure out who I was a big part of growing up. And then, and kind of trying to understanding all those different perspectives. It was a survival mechanism for me. And so I had early training in that. And then when I went abroad, it was, again, the same thing. You go abroad and you go to a new place and you have to learn a language. You have to learn not just the words, but the way that people speak, the way that they interact. What are they not saying? And what does it mean that they're not saying? So that was really important for me. And also just meeting amazing people who had all these different perspectives and maybe opposite perspectives sometimes, but all of them thought they were doing the right thing. They were beautiful people. They had, there was something beautiful about all of them. That I think that's really come out in my work, and it's one of the main through lines, not intentionally, but it's just one of the things that really interests me, and I think and it can be really powerful.
I think people sometimes overly simplify the idea of influences, where it's like you go to Barnes & Noble and you read a bunch of books and like those are the lexicon of comic language you have.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. It's like your experience of being raised by your parents and going to the places where they're from, and also your experience of traveling abroad for your job. Both of those things are influences. Those are things that are going to affect the way you do things and also what you end up writing. And it's interesting how we kind of ignore those. All inputs are influences. It's just, some are greater than others.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing actually, this is a kind of an epiphany I had after I wrote Maxwell's Demons, especially because that really was a book that was my first comic, my first big comic anyway. And that was really a book that was primarily about other comics I had read or other things that I had read. And I think a lot of the media that we consume now, a lot of the art that we see is primarily responding to other works of art. And I think that's kind of a mistake. I think the best art is responding to life. And I think since then, what I tried to do was address my work to life more than I did to other pieces of art. And that doesn't mean that art isn't an influence on other art isn't an influence. It is. I have a ton of respect for it and love for that. But primarily what I'm trying to do is capture something about what it's like to be alive in my work and that feeling of what it's like to be alive. And I think art is at its best when it does that, because otherwise what you're getting is a photocopy of a photocopy, and every photocopy is a bit of a degradation. And so though I am influenced by a lot of other art, comic, prose, what have you, I'm making a concerted effort to be more influenced by the world around me and what I see around me and my thoughts and feelings about that. And I think that was where my work really improved a lot, at least as I see it.
I could tell because this is the weirdest spoiler that's ever existed, but reading Assorted Crisis Events #2 had me heavily considering changing my diet, which is not something I would have expected. But all right, so you were on a path. You were on a medical path. What ultimately made you want to make comics?
Yeah, well, I've always loved comics and I always loved taking them apart and trying to figure out what made them work and why they were so compelling and why some were so compelling and why others weren't, and why even ones that I didn't like personally were really popular. That was just like a fun, it's that science thing of wanting to see how things work, and wanting to figure out how things work. And so I was always interested in them kind of in that intellectual way. And I've just always loved superheroes, especially I've always loved, since I can remember, since I was 5 years old, I've loved superheroes. And so I made the decision. It's not that I quit medicine for comics. I made the decision to quit medicine for my own reasons and kind of took a or not took a year. I had a year where I was very aimless and not really sure what I was going to do. And kind of within that year, I decided I would give comics a shot just because I enjoyed it so much. And I saw that Mark Miller had a talent hunt. That was his first year that he was doing a talent hunt thing. And I turned in a script for that and it won. And that was one of the first indications that I might be able to do this, that I could make something out of it. And so and then it was just a very long process of writing and getting a lot of rejections and writing and getting a lot of rejections and things not getting off the ground. And ultimately I was able to get one project through, called Maxwell's Demons. And that had its issues. And then I disappeared for many years and I was working on my work and trying to figure out what my voice was going to be. And everyone that I knew that started around the same time as I did became much more successful than me much earlier. And I think that was really, really good for me. I wasn't ready to have any kind of a bigger platform or a success. I didn't know what I wanted to write. In my opinion, there's no shortcuts to becoming a comic book writer. Like the years that you take trying to figure out all the different jobs and being able to have opinions about lettering and coloring and art and being able to have strong opinions about what kind of work that you want to do so that doesn't get subsumed by editorial or whatever. That's really important. Like I came to Marvel with a very strong idea of like what I wanted to do with my work and how to accomplish it and how to talk to artists about what I want, what I was going for and how to get there, in specific terms. And you really need to take a lot of time to do that. You need to make some comics on your own from scratch. And by scratch, I don't mean you have to draw. I mean, ideally, yes, you should draw and color and letter, but I didn't do that. But you have to do enough to know to say, this isn't working, this is what I want, and to be able to pick people who are aligned with you in their goals, their artistic goals.
I was going to bring up the fact that like Maxwell's Demons finished in 2017 and then 20th Century Men and Agents of World came in 2020. And like 20th Century Men was kind of the moment in a lot of ways where, I mean, you said earlier kind of that you didn't really know what all the image stuff entailed and maybe it wasn't as big of a success as you might have wanted to be or something like that. But the thing is that's the thing, that was your key. That was the thing that opened the doors in a lot of ways. I don't know. Like, I don't know what those 3 years were like if you were having stops and starts with varying projects and stuff like that. But the thing is it feels like during that time you figured who you were out and what you wanted to be as a storyteller. And like, I don't think you get 20th Century Men if you directly went from Maxwell's Demons into X, Y, or Z right afterwards and A, B, and C afterwards. Like you kind of almost needed that gap, it seems.
Yes, for sure. Well, first I want to say that 20th Century Men didn't like blow down the doors sales wise, but it was for me, I only look at it as a success because it was a giant artistic success for me. I'm super
It's an amazing book.
Thank you. I'm super proud of it. I loved, I became very close with Stepan, my collaborator. We're going to work together forever. Like I became a better artist while making it thanks to him and thanks to his influence and his work. And so that was a part of it. It took a long time to make. It takes time to improve and it takes time to make good art. Like that's just the reality of it. And the treadmill thing of comics can be, if you don't come in with a strong sense of what you want to do, it can really hurt the work in the end. And so I'm so grateful for that time. And there were a lot of starts and stops with those books too. I mean, I was working on Agent of World and I was working on Agent of World at the same time that I was working on Maxwell's Demons. That it took that long for it to come out, that long for it to be ready. 20th Century Men, I think I started right after Maxwell's Demons stopped, but it changed so much in the course of the making and the back and forth between Stepan and I. And I needed a lot of time to like you say, to develop my voice, to know what I wanted to do the research for that book, which is the big part of my work in general. Is there's just a ton of research for everything. Sometimes I'll read 3 or 4 books for an issues of Ultimates to be able to make sure that I'm doing justice to the type of stuff that I want to talk about. And so, yeah, I do think you need that time. And I do think this pressure to always have things on the stand or to be productive, I think is super detrimental to our development as artists. And so I'm never as happy as when I don't have anything coming out. There's no deadlines and I'm just kind of working on stuff with artists that I love and care about.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. 2025 is starting off with a bang over on Zoop. January is filled with launches from Rodney Barnes, Rapper Exhibit with artist Jonathan Wayshak, author Jenny Wood, The Pedestrians Joey Esposito, Zen the Intergalactic Ninjas Steve Stern, and more. There's still time to support campaigns from Riley Brown, Alex Segura, and Michael Marisi as well. Plenty more campaigns are coming soon to Zoop from the legendary Joe Quesada, Adriana Mello, Monster Forge Productions, and more that are yet to be announced. Zoop would like to thank all the creators who have recently submitted projects and urge all creators to submit your project to Zoop. Click the Submit Your Project link at zoop.gg as they are providing services to even more creators than ever before. And now, back to the show. I should say you did actually have something coming out during that window. You said about how you like tearing things apart and like figuring them out and everything, like, you know, trying to figure out why these things work. You were a regular contributor to Panel by Panel, the Eisner-winning comics criticism digital magazine by your pal Hassan Otzman El How. Do you think that experience helped you kind of figure things out at all?
The experience itself was great, and I love working with Haas. I was doing that for many years before I even started writing comics. I was doing that, and so doing that was very helpful to figuring out what I wanted to do with comics. But I'd been doing that for longer than my comics career was. It was at least 10 years. Since I was in high school, I was doing stuff like that. I was doing annotations for Grant Morrison's Batman, and like I was doing a ton of stuff like that. I was taking up, like, I don't know if you knew about this, but like Matt Fraction once posted this analysis of this sequence from Daredevil Born Again, and on his blog. I remember thinking, that's exactly what I do. Like, it was just this trying to tear apart how it worked and why it worked and what made it work, so you can understand the language, so that was really helpful, and doing that regularly. And I still do that when I read something that I love. I still try to take it apart and see how it works and see what I can learn from it. And that's one of the amazing things about working with artists, is that they teach you so much. So I'm working with Javi now on Absolute Martian Manhunter, and he's a genius, and he has such a strong sense of what comics should be, or what his project is in comics. And it's not that he's more right than anyone else that I've worked with, but it's so interesting to hear his perspective, which is so much about simplicity and clarity. And most artists care about clarity, but his approach is very specific and direct. And it's really inspiring. And I get to learn from all these different people that I work with. And every artist that I work with is a learning experience too. I don't write for Stepan the way that I write for Eric, the way that I write for Javi. Every single one of them, I have to kind of relearn from scratch how to write to get the best out of them, I guess, or to make sure I'm giving them room to be their best. And that has been really, I'm just so grateful for that. Like, I get excited and I'll write to like Javi will say something and I'll get so excited by this thing that I learned from him that I'll write to Eric, who's the artist on Assorted Crisis Events, and I'll be like, this is what Javi said, like, think about this. And then we kind of geek out about that. And so it's been lovely.
I do want to give a quick shout out. So Javier Rodriguez is the Javi you're talking about, the artist on Absolute Martian Manhunter. In my opinion, the best working artist today. I think he's unbelievable. Unbelievable. He operates on a wavelength that is completely unlike anyone else. But I do want to give a shout out. Eric Zawadzki is somebody that I've always said is amazing and is just waiting for the right I mean, he's always been good. People who read his stuff know that, but like, I feel like he needed a project that really highlights his work in a great way. He did that once. This book is amazing. Eternal by him and Ryan Kate Lindsay. I absolutely love it. But I mean, Assorted Crisis Events, what a showcase for him. It is absolutely amazing. But I did want to ask about the artist side of things. When you're finding artistic partners for creator-owned projects in particular, is it more about finding the artist and then building the project, or more finding the right artist for the project?
It's both, right? And then, so it's like, in my experience, what I do is You
knew Stepan before you did 20th Century Men at all, right?
Yes, but I came to him with 20th Century Men, having seen his other work and I thought, understand it. He was doing already some kind of war stuff. And so I thought this will be good. But what I would like to say is, like, in the process of doing that book, the book completely changed kind of not what it was about plot wise, but tonally, how it worked when I saw what he was good at, and what he was so good at, which was this humanity that he puts in characters. And so the way I always put it is Stepan is poetry, pure poetry in the way that he draws in. Eric, who did, as you say, Eternal, and previous to that, The Dregs, which was also fantastic. Mm-hmm. Eric is much more like science and architecture and math. There's something very clockwork about his stuff. So when I work with Stepan, I don't focus so much on the formal play stuff. I focus much more on the voice, and making sure that the voice and the characters are as beautiful and resonant as possible, because I know that is, and the character interactions, because I know that he's going to kill that stuff. And if something comes out of that, if formal stuff comes out of that, great. But when I work with Eric, I'm much more thinking, look, what can we do here with the form of comics? Because I know that he's going to be able to, he loves to play with that stuff on his own, and he adds a ton of that stuff anyway. But if we can have the basis of the thing be, some kind of structural, formal thing that he's gonna make that really sing, and it's gonna make the book really sing. And so every person and with Javi on Absolute Martian Manhunter, like I pitched the book with his art in the pitch. He didn't agree or anything like that, but like his previous art, I was just like, this is what we need,
A real Javier Rodriguez type.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, I think I said in there, I will give my left testicle to get him, as the artist for this, because he's done a lot of psychedelic stuff. And I knew that the book was going to be pretty psychedelic, but there was also a clarity to his work that was really going to be necessary for a book that is going to be intentionally kind of confused. Not that the reader shouldn't be confused, but the main character of John Jones is going to be kind of not really sure what's real and what's not through a lot of it. And so, yeah, so I go to them, I go to artists having done a lot of research about what they've done previously. And I wouldn't go to an artist if I didn't think I had something for them that was interesting. Sometimes you know the artist and you build something for them, from scratch out of kind of early idea or, some nascent ideas that you have. And the key is finding something that you're passionate about and interested in, and that you think you can write really well, and something that they're going to be interested in, and kind of somewhere meeting in that middle. And then so much of the actual comic just comes out of the back and forth that you have. And so every single artist has completely transformed my approach to the work. And is not just drawing something, but is integral to the writing of it. Like I'm responding, so much of what I'm writing is responding to them and what they're putting out. And I'm in the process of that with Martian Manhunter now, where we're knowing a little bit more about Javi's project, his artistic project, his philosophy has greatly influenced the way the later issues are being written.
Not to be overly literal, but I do love the fact that your Time book has the artist that you described as working like clockwork.
Yeah.
It's very fitting.
That was very intentional. I knew he would rock it. Like I knew that he would do, like, time is so bound up in comics. It's such a powerful thing in comics because space equals time in comics. And I just knew that Eric would be amazing at it. I never considered anybody else.
I got to give you a lot of credit. I'm not saying nobody else does this. This absolutely happens, but you don't just think of the artist collaborators. One of my favorite moments from the first issue, I'm going to say it. It means nothing to anyone else. You know what I'm going to be talking about. Not with a bang, but with a cut.
Yeah.
That was a moment to highlight Haas.
Yeah.
And he killed it. And it's like, I'm sure that when you were doing that, you knew what you wanted, and like you knew Haas would kill it, right?
Yeah. And that's what I mean with, needing to make comics on your own or whatever. Like, if you want to make great comics, like, you need to be able to think about what can a colorist do here that's interesting, and make a suggestion. That's not to say that they're going to take the suggestion, but I will try to be thinking on all these different levels, playing with lettering. What can we do with lettering? Like, Haas takes it and runs with it, and he's going to make it work no matter what. But and knowing people that are going to want to take those risks with you, like knowing that Jordy is going to want to push things and be non-literal with colors and stuff, knowing that Haas is going to take risks and do risky things, and having those people. We don't have to have Rolodexes, but having relationships with those people, that's so important. And so I don't really need to be a great letterer to know that Haas is a great letterer, and to know that Haas is gonna push things. I just need to be able to recognize great lettering. I need to be able to recognize great coloring and have opinions about choices that they make. Every person is just making incredible choices, and I want, with my creator-owned work especially, on anything I do, I want everybody to have input. But with my creator-owned work especially, I'm gratified to see how each person transforms and elevates the stuff. With Jordy's colors elevate the issue so much, like it's unbelievable. Eric elevates the script so much with what he draws, and Haas elevates the script too. Like, he'll even make something about Haas is he'll make choices about bolding and stuff that usually letterers don't do. And sometimes I'll tell him, no, that's not what I want. But often or size changes or whatever, but often it's really great.
I do want to talk about your project mix. Like, if you look at your slate of comics in 2024 and now 2025, it's actually a pretty unique mix. It includes Ultimates at Marvel, Absolute Martian Manhunter at DC, Assorted Crisis Events, and Ice Cream Man number 43 at Image. So one page in a one shot filled with a bunch of one-page writers, and the story Air Medicine for 3 Worlds, 3 Moons. You're following what is right for you, but I'm curious as to what that is. Like, what guides you as you decide which projects to take on?
Yeah, well, it's different in each case, right? Air Medicine, they reached out and they said, you can work with whoever you want. And I
You're like, Stepan.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's just another opportunity to work for Steve with Stepan in a in a short little thing and just do a short little project. And I really had a lot of fun with that. We both had a lot of fun with that. It's always transcendent working with him because there's just so much back and forth, and he's so improvisational and it's just lovely. We have something much bigger in the works as well. Our next big thing, and that will be announced in San Diego, I think. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. But we've been working on that already for quite a while, and that's wonderful. And then with Ultimates, yeah, reached out. Will Moss, the editor of Ultimates, reached out and just asked me, and I really wasn't sure that I was going to do it, but I sat on it for a while and thought about it, and the opportunity was just too much to pass up in terms of the creative opportunity of being able to recreate the Marvel universe according to my whims. That has been a really unique, I feel very grateful that I've had that opportunity, just because you could go your whole career and not have the kind of opportunity that I've got there in terms of the creative freedom, getting to play with these icons, but the creative freedom to do my own thing with them. And that has been a, I don't know, it's not a thing that I dreamed of, but it's been a real privilege to do. And then Assorted Crisis Events, creator owned is really where my heart is. And so
Right.
I'd like to do that as much as I can with that, but we've been working on that for years. And I'm also really grateful that I get to do a book like that and take our time with it and make every issue feel like an event, which is what I try to do on Ultimates, try to do on all my work. But I think Assorted Crisis Events is one of the books where I really feel like we've hit it. I set a high bar for ourselves, and I think we met it. I want to do as much of that kind of work as I can, and I don't really care how often it comes out. Assorted Crisis Events is going to be an ongoing series, and it's going to come out regularly, but it took a lot of time to get to the place where that could happen. And I'm super grateful to do that. And then Absolute Martian Manhunter, Scott Snyder just reached out and was like, "Hey, do you want to do anything? I'm doing this Absolute Universe thing. Do you want to do anything?" They had already picked the big 5 characters, and so it was. I had an interest in certain ideas and themes in science and stuff that neuroscience in particular, and that I thought would pair nicely with the Martian Manhunter. And the real draw there for me was working with Javi, which has been just unbelievable. And I've really also gotten to become very close with Scott over this time. And that's been really awesome too. Because we both have a lot of the same influences and literary influences. And his background was in literature, was literary fiction. And a lot of those people that he's met or interacts with are heroes of mine. So
yeah, I mean, he came up co-writing with Stephen King. So there's it's funny. When I had Scott and Jason Aaron and Kelly Thompson on the podcast not that long ago, we were talking about the artists of the books. And I was like, and we haven't even mentioned Javier Rodriguez, who's coming up. And they were all just like, "Oh my God. Oh, you have no idea." And I was just like, I want to know, though. I want to know what Javier's going to do there. But
it's unbelievable. Even I am surprised continually by what he produces each issue. It is both taking what I'm writing and being extremely faithful to it and totally transforming it and making it so much better. So it's really inspiring. And I feel like, again, fundamentally, the projects are about working with the people that I get to work with. That's the thing that drives me most, and getting to learn. And in the comic is almost, the end result comic is almost secondary to the process of making them for me. It's been unbelievable.
Does somebody like Scott factor into that thinking? Like, you said that you find a lot of commonalities with Scott. Did that commonality and the fact that you felt like you kind of almost had a kindred spirit in some ways, you're going to be a part of this thing with this person who's kind of shepherding this whole Absolute thing. Does that factor in at all?
He was really nice at the beginning, but
you didn't know him yet.
I didn't know him, so it was like it didn't make my decision for me. It was really more working with Javi that sort of made my decision for me. It has been a lovely surprise and a lovely gift that has been true, and certainly it makes me want to do more stuff with him, for him, or whatever. To know that there's somebody like that who has a management role at one of the big 2 is really special, because he really, really cares about comics, and he really, really cares about the work, insanely. He cares about the work so much, and he cares about the readers so much, and about delivering for them. And for somebody at his level to care that much has been really inspiring. And I care a lot about the work too. And so to know that there's somebody who kind of feels the same way they do about comics, but also about the work itself, and cares a lot about making great comics, and has really good taste about what good comics are, I think is really special and not something that's so common in the history of comics. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because once you get Scott talking, it's hard to get him to stop because he's so passionate about it. But it's funny. I was reading this TCJ interview you had done with Zach Rabaroff, where it was you and it was Stepan Morian and Aditya Bidikar. Aditya described you as basically a pastor of comics, where you were like, you just try to get people into comics because you love them so much. So it's maybe you and Scott kind of have that in common too, where you have this unshakable enthusiasm for the art form, even if the rest of it can be imperfect at times.
definitely.
I want to go back to one thing you said in there. You said with Ultimates, it seemed like there was a hesitance to say yes. What was it about that made you a little bit more uncertain than with the rest of them?
Yeah, it was just like plugging into a universe that I didn't really like. The Ultimates universe was still very new, and this was going to be like a team book, which I'd never done before. So I just wasn't sure. It seemed like it was going to be a lot of work, and I wasn't sure I was ready, and I didn't want to disappoint people. And, it is a lot of work. It's much more work than the average, I think, licensed big two book, but it's all work that I set for myself. You know what I mean? Like it's all stuff that I decided I wanted to do. And so it was a huge opportunity, but I definitely didn't want to disappoint people or in any way sully what they were trying to do with the book. Before I do something, I really want to be sure that I have like a really strong idea of what it's going to be, what my pitch is. And so the first couple of days, it was kind of just like, oh, I don't know. It's do I have something to say, that would make a new Ultimates worth it? That would be as radical in its way as the original Ultimates was, and that would fit the times the way that book fit the times. And it was a big challenge, I thought, and I didn't want to fail. So, but ultimately, no pun intended.
Yeah.
I found something that I am really passionate about, and I think, I hope I've delivered. Who knows?
There's two things to it. One, I think people like make the comparison between Ultimate and Absolute a little too easily, in the sense that like Ultimates, you go in and there's already an established partial team. There's like Iron Lad and Doom and Sif and Thor and there's somebody else, Captain America. They're already established by I think the Ultimate Universe one shot or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
So you go in and you have that. And then on top of that, you have to fit within this overall architecture of the universe that's based on the premise that at some point in time, I think 18 months or whatever it is, that the maker is coming back. So you have to fit within that. Versus Absolute, where it's basically a blank slate.
Yeah.
You just like go in and it's like, I'm doing Absolute Martian Manhunter with Javi and we're just going to do our thing. And
exactly.
I think that those comparisons are too easily made when one is in the current state, much more universal, and the other one is like tabula rasa. You're starting from scratch. You're just doing this. And I will say though, the one thing that I really appreciate, like I've seen some people say things like, this isn't like the other Ultimates. And I guess if it's a bad thing, I mean, the thing is Mark Miller and Brian Hitch's Ultimates was a response to that moment in time.
Yeah.
It is a much different moment in time now. And if it was the same thing, it would be weird as hell.
Yeah, that was sort of my thesis. Was I didn't want to do another Avengers book, and I didn't want it to be an Ultimates book that was like the Ultimates from the turn of the millennium. It's a very different time. And so the best way that I could honor that, I thought, was to change whatever I felt needed to be changed and try to make it of this moment, as you said. And John had done a lot of the groundwork for that. This sense of disappointment, the sense that something had been taken from us, and made it and put in the superhero vernacular, the superpower vernacular. That was all really good, and I wanted to, if anything, magnify that. I think one thing that's throwing people or is troubling people is I don't see it as a team book. I know that people see it as a team book. I wanted to create something that was not just another team book. We've seen 1,000 Avengers books. We've seen 1,000 team books. Like, this was my way of doing a quote unquote team book in a new way. And because we had this whole universe to play with, I felt, let's take advantage of having a whole universe to play with. And so it's, as I said in the original pitch, both to Marvel and to readers, it's less of a team and much more of a network, and so it's not going to have as much interaction between team members as I think some people would want. And that's very much by design. Not because there's anything wrong with that, just because I wanted to do something in a new way. And I think of course there is interaction between members and there should be, but yeah, I just wanted the structure to be something different. I wanted it to feel different from a lot of the Avengers books that we've read, or a lot of the Justice League books that you've read, even the other Ultimates books that we've read,
I'm not going to say this is the reason why you did it, but I do think it's funny that the one time they got together and did like something as a team, they just got their asses beat.
Yeah.
It's almost like a metaphor of like, see, this is what happens when they behave in not the way that I have set up.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I think
that's not why you did it.
That's not why I did it, but it certainly is like the old ways don't work. That's sort of that is one of the premises. It's like the traditional way doesn't work, and we need to come up with new ways of doing things, not just doing the old ways and hope that they work out.
This is a funny question, but I have to ask it anyways. Do you think you're capable of not swinging for the fences?
It's funny because I don't know, because I don't think of myself as swinging for the fences, and this is something that
it's just what you do, right?
Yeah, right. It's how my mind works, So it's like Matt Rosenberg asked me that, or said that my first thing, Maxwell's Demons, was a big risk or a big swing for the fence, and I didn't think of it that way. It was just not trying to get bored, trying to do something that I would find interesting as a reader, as a reader who's read a lot of comics already. And I think when I approach a new book, whether it's something I'm creating from scratch or a title character or whatever, I always want to do the most interesting thing that I can do. And that was true of when I was plugging into the Fall of X stuff with Children of the Vault.
Right.
And that's been true of Ultimates. And that was, I don't know. Yeah, I guess because I don't really see it as anything other than my process or the writing process. Yeah, maybe I'm not capable of not. We'll see. We'll see if I maintain it.
I mean, it's just, there's two things to it. Like, one, I think fundamentally it's hard to imagine you doing, for lack of better words, a meat and potatoes superhero book where it's just like, I can't imagine you doing like a 120 issue run of Amazing Spider-Man where it's just like he's swinging through and doing his thing, because that's what readers want. I don't think you would be happy doing that. I don't know you that well, but
no,
I feel
I would.
Yeah. And then the other thing about it is I have to give your editors credit for seeing who you are and like fitting you to that, because like, to be honest, there's not a lot of X-Men books that I would have been like, this is a fit, but Children of the Vault, that makes sense for you. So it's like, to some degree, shouts to editorial for like understanding who you are.
And giving me a ton of room, either to hang myself or what have you, but certainly everywhere that I, both in Children of the Vault and Ultimates, I've had an insane amount of support, an insane amount of room to do whatever I felt I wanted to do. And I put a lot of pressure on myself to make the work good. And I have I'm not trying to burn Marvel Comics to the ground or anything. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to show why these characters are interesting and cool, and what does a hero look like in the 21st century with Ultimates in particular. What does it mean to be a hero? And maybe that's different from what it was in the 1960s or even in the year 2000. I send these pretty radical pitches, and I kind of expect to get knocked down. And most of my friends who see them also expect them to get sent back as not possible. And every time the editors and the the higher ups at both DC and Marvel has just been like, yeah, great, let's do it. And I hope it's because at the core of all of these is a lot of respect and love for the superheroes in general and for these characters in particular. And it's not my only goal with the Ultimate stuff, but for instance, with the Ultimates, I'm not just, destroying things. I don't think I'm trying to build things there.
Yeah.
Show why these characters should be relevant and cool to people and powerful. Or I hope that's what the editorial is recognizing. And you kind of know what the limits are before you go in, and those limits are partially self-imposed. I don't want to be exploitative. I don't want to just do things for crash shock value. So when I make a decision, when I take a risk or take a swing, it's not just to surprise readers or anything. It's because I think you'll get something out of it as a reader. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You're here to save America, Deniz.
Yes. Somebody is, for sure, yeah.
I mean, literally America Chavez. I'd like that beat. Yeah, that was
exactly.
Nice. I do want to say, shouts to your editors to also letting you do your formal experimentation. Always an issue 4s for you. It's 20th Century Men had the Battle of Bow Arts, and then Fantastic Four-centric issue in Ultimates #4. I love that, like, for some reason, that's a thing. It's like #4.
I have no idea why. It's really not intentional, but it's something that's been pointed out to me. Something about 4s, man. Who knows?
Well, I mean, the Fantastic Four one makes sense, but at the same time.
Yeah.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Harley Creed is a bad man. He used to be worse. Now, he has 7 days left to live in the place he wants to leave the most. Oni Press is proud to present Mine is a Long, Lonesome Grave, the tale of a man who wants redemption but is facing down his own death instead. After getting out of prison, Harley wanted nothing more than to leave his hometown behind forever, but instead he's trapped there with a curse on his head, and only a week to figure out which of a long list of hateful suspects want him gone. In a town where magic and murder go hand in hand, Your death could come from anyone. Mine is a long, lonesome grave, a story of Appalachian horror from strange town of Luther Strode's Justin Jordan and House of Slaughter's Chris Sheehan will darken the doorsteps of comic shops everywhere on February 12th from Oni Press. And now, back to the show. And speaking of formal experimentation, I do want to talk about your upcoming Image series, Assorted Crisis Events, which arrives on March 12th in specific. Here's the solicit for listeners that don't know about it. Time is having a crisis. Mingling in the red light district, you can find actual cavemen, medieval knights, and cyborg soldiers on leave from World War IV. Victorian debutantes amble their way into cell phone stores, confused and bewildered. What is a data plan? On their way to work, bleary-eyed commuters get trapped in time loops, assaulted by alternate reality versions of themselves, and try to avoid post-apocalyptic wastelands. And look, the 315 bus just took a wrong turn into the Neolithic era. Rising stars Deniz Camp and Eric Zawadski and Eisner winners Jordi Belair and Hassan Otsman-Elhau are proud to present Assorted Crisis Events, an ongoing zigzagging anthology series about the compromised clicks of our clocks, full of one-shot stories, both beautiful and ugly, tragic and redemptive, surreal and somehow all too familiar. I gotta say, that's like the first time I've ever completely gotten a solicit right. So yay!
Amazing.
I have read the first 2 issues of this. They're genuinely some of the best single issue comics I've read in the past few years. It is absolutely amazing.
Thank you so much.
The first issue is great. Then the second issue, a non-complete version, I must add, was like, I was reading it and I was just like, I don't think I've ever read anything like this. This is absolutely unbelievable. This series finds you getting back to creator owned after doing a fair amount of for hire for the last couple of years. How does that feel? Does it feel nice getting back into the swing of things with that?
It feels, well, the thing that you have to keep in mind is
you've been working on it for years.
I started writing this when we were halfway through 20th Century Men or something like that. So for me, I've never left. For me, it feels that way.
Sounds like a temporal event.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So there is this feeling, it's not like a coming back to it for me. But it's an important part of my creative mix, as you called it. Like, I really, really love creator-owned work, and it's just the place where you can take all the risks all the time and not do, there's, like I said, there's certain limitations that I understand about superhero comics, and I'm not, it's not that editorial is imposing them on me, but I'm kind of imposing some of them on myself. There's a certain amount of action, a certain way that the stories go. Whereas with creator-owned, I feel total freedom to just do whatever and to really draw. Like I said, that book in particular, Assorted Crisis Events, is really drawn from my experience of life around me.
It's just how the world feels.
Yeah, exactly. So that really was born out of my one sentence pitch for it is Crisis on Infinite Earths if it was happening to normal people, or Black Mirror if time and space were breaking down. But what it really is born out of is this feeling that I've had over the last 10 years. But it really, for some people, it's been going on longer, and it's really accelerated since the pandemic, which was just that it's one goddamn crisis after another.
Right.
It feels like, personally and nationally and internationally, it just feels like one thing after another. Everything that can go wrong is going wrong. Things are unraveling. And we all kind of have to live through that. We all have to live with it. And what does it feel like to live in a world like that? And what does it feel like to be a victim of a world like that? You know what I mean? So That's what that book is about.
So was that kind of where that idea was rooted? Was when you were first coming up with it, it was just kind of trying to tap into those feelings, and then you went and found Eric and Jordy and Haas came on and everything like that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Eric and I have been friends almost for as long as I've been in comics. I met him at a New York Comic Con when he was doing Dregs, and we just hit it off because we both we're all about taking apart the medium and about pushing ourselves. And Eric is obsessed with turning out great work and being really interesting, and he really wants to put out masterpieces, and I care about that too. I want to put out the best work that I can, and so we were always vibes, but I was just not very successful at that point, and he had hit it big with Dregs and had some creative juice behind him, and so we were just friends, and we would talk a lot about comics, but we talked about working together on things, and but it just never really worked out. And also, again, because working on a creator-owned thing with me was a risk, and is still a risk. So when I was coming up with the idea, I knew that I wanted to work with Eric on it because I knew that I wanted it to be heavily formal and like I said before, like this kind of have these really intricate structures and play with the medium a lot. And I knew that Eric would be able to do that and would want to do that. He'd be, especially if you read some of the later issues, it's just unbelievable, the stuff that I've asked him to do and the stuff that he chooses to do. Most artists would be miserable doing a lot of this stuff, doing a lot of that stuff, but he loves it, or at least he tells me he loves it. So
I love that he's got back-to-back time books, at least for us, because he did Time Before Time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like he's clockwork, man. Clockwork.
yes.
One thing I really like in it, and there's only so many examples I can use, but like the first issue, there's a line about World War III or World War IV that shows up a couple times.
Yeah.
I like how, and you did this in 20th Century Man, you probably do it in other books too. It feels like there's like callbacks or parallel lines or like echoes in your like your own writing, where, especially in the second issue, there's this part, it's not palindromic, but the second issue feels like it's this piece that's kind of collapsing on its own center. And I don't even know if that makes sense, but
yes, it ends up in a fugue, right? Like it's a musical piece. And I think of it as that one in particular, I think of it as music. And so, you're setting up all these themes, page, and that one, each issue or each page is kind of its own moment, right? Like in the beginning, and then in the end, I called it the fugue segment, where everything kind of collapses on itself and intermingles, and I like thinking about structures that way. It comes very natural to me to think about the structure of an issue in particular.
That did make me wonder, though, like when you write, do you think, it sounds like you think in overall structure rather than like details first, because it's like you need the lines to make those beats pop, but you need the structure to make them make sense relative to one another. What do you think first?
I think of story first, and then how best to fit it all together is what it is. And so the structure is really born out of the necessity of the story. So each story has its own sort of, there's a lot of potential in how you can tell a story. You can tell a story very simply, linearly. I find that if you have a lot of space, that's really nice. Or if you're doing things that are very confusing, it's nice to go linearly. But if you don't have a lot of space, then structure becomes more important. And especially with single issues, you don't have a lot of space. But also just story, I think the form follows function. Like the stories determine the feeling that I'm trying to evoke, the kinds of stories that I'm trying to tell. All that determines kind of the structure of the issue of the story themselves. And so every issue in Assorted Crisis Events, you see that, and you also see that even with Ultimates. They're single issues, and sometimes they're going back and forth in time with issue 2. Sometimes it's weird experimental, like issue 4. Sometimes it's just straight ahead. It just depends on what you're trying to do. And I think that is kind of the key difference. Like I'm doing a 9 grid on the Luke Cage issue, is that issue 9. And that's to evoke a certain feeling, which is the monotony, the regularity, and also the feeling of bars, and like, because it's largely taking place in prison.
1 year to life. Not a good sentence.
Yes, not a good, exactly. Not a good sentence, which is, by the way, I've heard a lot of people say that it's Kafkaesque. This is real. This was a thing that people were actually sentenced to in the 60s and 70s pretty regularly. George Jackson, very famously, this is recognized internationally as a form of torture, these indeterminate sentences. Mm-hmm. But the United States has been doing them for quite a while. So it is the story that you're trying to tell, I think, that should determine the structure. And the structure is always in service of the story and the characters, I think.
I do think it's interesting you described it as a fugue, because I've described artists in this way. Javier is somebody I definitely describe in this way. And I think he describes himself in this way too. There's a musicality to his work. I kind of feel like there is to your writing to some degree, and like the way that you approach it. Like I said, like the echoes and everything like that. There is like, it's not audio, but there's like an audio quality to it, which might make no sense.
No, for sure. I mean, it depends on, some issues are more musical than others, but in general, my thesis for comics is the medium that the medium that they're closest to is poetry, because you're trying to distill as much information as you can down to convey as much as you can in as little space as possible. And you're using formal stuff to do that usually. And so I think I'm approaching, a lot of my work has this kind of poetic feel, or at least I'm hoping for, and also musical feel, because there's this, with the panels and everything, there's a rhythm that is created. And I think a lot of really great, like Javi is a musician. He's a very talented musician. And my friend W. Maxwell Prince is also a musician, and a lot of really great writers. I think Morrison was a musician as well. Like a lot of really great writers have this internal sense of timing and rhythm. And I'm not. I played violin when I was younger. My mother is a very talented musician, but comics is more my medium, I guess.
I mean, Assorted Crisis Events #2 has like basically each page begins and finishes. I think it's each page with basically like small panel, bigger panel that continues the first two ones. It's almost like a count-in. And it's a really nice little tool. But I did want to ask, the title. When did you have the title?
Late.
It
took me a long time to come up with the title. I was really struggling with that.
Perfect.
Thank you. I'm so proud of that title. I love the title Assorted Crisis Events. It's just one of those things where it took me like literally years to come up with the title. I mean, I think at least a year or two into having written it, and I was thinking about the book like 2 or 3 years before that. So it's like it took a long time, and a lot of false starts with that. Title is not something that comes to me quickly. It's a lot of creators say that the first thing they think of is title. Very rarely do titles come to me quickly or easily.
I mean, you mentioned Matt Rosenberg in his other capacity as a professional podcaster.
Yeah.
But he's like somebody who's good proof of the fact that like a good title can make a big difference. And the thing I love about this title is it's both completely accurate. It is absolutely Assorted Crisis Events, which even speaks to the anthology nature of the book, to be honest.
Yeah.
But it's also like a perfect comic book name, given the history of stories within single issue comics. Like I don't know, it's like DC's had so many crises and the events are a big part of it. And it's just like, it basically is speaking comic book language in the title.
Yes. And I've actually heard from a number of people that they go to their store to pre-order it, and the store manager
which one
will be like, well, exactly, do you have any specific crisis events in mind? And I love that. I think that is hopefully it won't be too confusing, but yeah, I'm really pleased with it, but it does not come easily to me, and that was it was a stroke of lightning.
Isn't it funny? So we started this talking about all the things that people don't really realize that go into the job of making comics. And it seems like for you, I don't want to overly simplify your relationship with writing, but it seems like writing is not as hard as like the things that seem like they should be simpler, like coming up with 3 words for a title, or like, doing all the behind the scenes business stuff. Sometimes that stuff is way more difficult than just writing a comic that seems unknowable to us as readers. Like, how do you do that process? Impossible. A title makes sense. It's funny.
I spend a lot more time writing than I do spend on anything else, but I enjoy that so much. Even when I'm frustrated and I hate myself and I hate everything and I hate the world and I hate the comic. At the end of it, I tell Eric at the end of every script of Assorted Crisis Events, I'm like, I'm never doing this again. I hate this. Like, God damn it. And then a week later, I'm like, I really need to write more Assorted Crisis Events, like because I'm so great. It takes a lot out of me, but I'm also really proud of it and really. And it's like, it's good. You're good tired at the end of it. What I mean? Whereas some of the business stuff for me, or even like, I was really happy about the title, but because it is so important, but it's not the kind of work that I necessarily enjoy doing as much, if that makes sense.
No, I mean, it saps your brain in a different way. Like for me, so I not only do off panel, but I also have sketched and I write about things. And yesterday's big news was when we're recording on Wednesday, was that Diamond filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So instead of writing, I spent most of my day like emailing and texting and talking to people within the industry to be like, what's going on? And I was so tired at the end of the day. I could write like a 5,000 word article in like 2 hours and I'd feel energized afterwards. That's no problem. You ask me to email people and text people over and over all day about this sort of thing, and I am just bushed. And like, that's just how it works sometimes.
And then it's that double depressing thing of what do you really have to show for it at the end? Like it's like at the end of a script, at writing a comic book script, I have a comic book script. But if it's like all I did was email a bunch of people and like kind of work things out, it just doesn't feel like I accomplished anything that day, if that makes any sense. Which it's not to say that I didn't accomplish anything, but it's just there's not a tangible result in the same way that there is when I've written a script, or even when I've gotten art back from the artist or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, so it's less satisfying in that way sometimes. Some people love it though, and the best, I think, the most successful people around, like Ram V loves, like he really thinks about this stuff, and like, or maybe he doesn't love it, but he's really good at it, and like he looks at it as a challenge, as a creative challenge to talk about these things and or to get all this stuff in exactly the right way. And I think it serves you well if you can think that way. I was not prepared to necessarily do the business side of things as much, and I don't enjoy it quite as much.
Understandably. I could go on about Assorted Crisis Events, but most of my notes at this point, I sent myself a bunch of emails as I was reading. It was just random notes like War Boys and Nose Picker. And I'm like, we can't get into that stuff. It's too in the weeds. listeners, read Assorted Crisis Events. But I want to close with some bigger topics, like things that involve your thoughts about kind of what you do outside of the writing of the stuff. And I told you I wanted to bring up something in specific before we started recording. One of the strange things about writing comics, but particularly superhero comics in 2025, is that there's always been letters columns. People have always been aware of the fact that like X, Y, or Z may not like the work or whatever. But as I told you before we started recording, I was researching and I saw a lot of YouTube videos where you were the subject, but it wasn't about the work. It was about you. You were the subject. And all of them were pretty bad faith, to be honest. There's that, but you've also dealt with death threats aimed at you and your family, which is all horrible. It's all horrible. That's like the extreme version of like the stuff you have to deal with as a creator today. It's not just coming up with titles, but it's nonsense like that. You seem to handle it well from the outside. How do you navigate that stuff today? Is that just a reality of what you have to do?
Yeah, I think the way that I navigate it is I don't take any of it very seriously because I see, number one, there's a low barrier of entry to a death threat, for instance. It's very cheap and easy to find me online and to write that you're going to rape my wife, which is something that I've gotten quite a few times. And it's terrible, and these people need help. And but also they might be, but it takes so little to do that. You know, maybe they're young, maybe they have some kind of learning disability or something. There's all kinds of reasons for that. Sometimes it's about my politics, which I've made very clear, especially in relation to the genocide in Gaza, and that was part of the death threat stuff. And I'm happy to, speech without consequence is meaningless, and so that doesn't bother me that there's these kinds of consequences. It wouldn't bother me particularly if I was fired from a book for the things that I choose to say or do. That is part and parcel with caring about things. It's okay. That's why I don't really take cancel culture seriously. Like, speech has consequences. The things that you do and say have consequences. That's normal. That's good. In a world without consequences for speech, the speech doesn't have any kind of impact. That's why, right? That's the only reason that it wouldn't have consequences. So I look at it, number one, that if the death threats have some kind of substance to them, then I look at it as a success because I'm reaching people and I'm touching on something that's important, or especially like these videos that you're talking about where I'm the subject and they're taking me down. Obviously, they think I'm a threat to them. I'm glad for that. I want to be a threat to them.
I learned you're a degenerate. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I actually, my wife was well aware of that long before, so it's totally fine. My friends all know that. Everyone in my life knows that. No, I mean, and then the other thing is that you have to understand that a lot of this stuff is monetized, and so these guys that are making these videos about me, like, honestly, I'm sure that they're fine in person, or maybe not. I don't know. But my experience has been in person, most people are fine, but that when there's this distance of the internet, it creates this ability to dehumanize people very simply and very easily. And I felt it myself because you have no real relationship with them. And so these guys are primarily making money. They're grifters, and like the online ecosphere, whatever you want to call it, like has been designed in such a way that, the monetization of social media, the monetization of YouTube, all this stuff, it has been designed in such a way that these absurdly over the top takes about people, these inflammatory videos or these inflammatory things, I don't think they care that much. I really don't think they care that much about me. I don't think they care that much about comics. I think they care about making money.
It's kayfabe.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Everything is professional wrestling these days. It feels like up to the politics.
Yeah.
And so, and so it's like, it's not hard for me to navigate these things because I don't take any of it personally. I think I have the most important piece of advice I can tell people. Well, one is, if you want to be great at something, you should try to do something that you love the process of doing, not the result of having done it.
Right.
So I think that's really important. I love writing. And so anytime all that other stuff intrudes, I can just go and write and I feel fine because the result, which is to say the response, is not even secondary. It's, tertiary. It's very far down the list of what's important to me, even fan response or whatever. I appreciate people who like my work, but it doesn't hurt me that they don't. And then two, you need to have a part of your life that's not. This is especially true of comics. There's so many people whose whole life is comics, and I understand that, and I appreciate that, but I also think it's extremely destructive for your whole life to be comics, for all of your friends to be related to comics, to your partner to be comics. I mean, if you find it great, and I'm not trying to hate on that, but I do think when the comic stuff goes bad, or when there's some kind of drama about you in comics, it's important that you can go out and be with friends who don't know about that or don't care about that, or a partner. My wife doesn't read my work and doesn't doesn't follow too much stuff on YouTube or doesn't follow the comics drama, and that's good. When I'm done with working, I can just go and be part of this other world. I can go out and walk and hang out with my friends who don't know if I'm a writer or an editor at Marvel. Like, they don't know the difference. Like, and that's cool. I think that's good for me as a person, and so that really helps. I can go out and literally touch grass. You know what I mean? Like,
I completely agree. It's funny. None of my day-to-day friends, I don't even know if any of them have ever read a comic outside of like comic strips, of which I'm not saying that like that is something you have to do, but it is. I do think sometimes it helps me kind of have a separation of church and state. It's like,
exactly.
You have your own space for yourself that isn't defined by that. I got to give you a lot of credit, because I think a lot of people would probably hear the stories that are happening to you. I think I saw like a tweet or whatever the hell, post, whatever, somewhere on social media these days about the death threats and everything. And I think a lot of people would probably be like, how does he keep doing it? Like, why does that affect your decisions? But it seems like the only thing it really does is kind of embolden you, because you realize that, frankly, talk is cheap. And if they're doing that, that means you're having an effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think for them to be responding to my work in any way means that they feel it needs to be responded. You know what I mean? And that is, so either it's a threat or it's popular enough or whatever. It's interesting enough. You don't respond to things that you don't care about at all. They think that
they want to control it.
Exactly. They think they need to get ahead of it in some way, or they at the very least want to ride the coattails of the energy that it has, the impact that it's having. Not to talk it up too much. I mean, we're still making comics. I understand that. But like, they believe at least that what we're doing is socially destructive or whatever. It's destructive to their conservative, and I use that term broadly, conservative projects, and not politically conservative, but socially conservative project.
This is why I talk about Stiltman all the time. I'm just trying to ride his coattails. I'm just waiting for that Stiltman bump. I'm still waiting.
All the way to the top.
All the way to the top. Yeah, elevate me there. But
yes.
To close, I mentioned before, I mean, I think I know the answer to this question at this point, but you have a nice mix right now. You have your 2 notable for hire projects and at least 1 creator-owned launch coming up. God only knows you have more irons in the fire. You mentioned a project with Steepon you're cooking up. You have been on a bit of a for hire kick of late. My question for you is, what do you want for yourself going forward? Do you want to lean more into creator-owned going forward? Do you like that more balanced profile? What do you want things to look like for you in the future?
In the future, I only want to do projects that I'm really passionate about. I think that is the main thing. The thing that I'm most afraid of and the thing that I'm most guarded against is taking on work to take on work and not having a strong sense of what I want to do with it and not being really excited by the project itself or the people that I'm working with. And so going forward, that is like, not that I have done that, but I see a lot of creators doing that. And I believe all I have is my name, and I need to make sure that every issue that I put out is as good as I can make it. And that doesn't mean every issue is going to be as good as every other, or it's going to be the best thing you've ever read. But I need to go in thinking that I have something really important to say with this project and with this issue in particular. And I need to be able to give myself time to find that thing, even if I don't know what it is at the start. I need to be able to find that. I need to give myself time and space, and I need to be working with people who push me and teach me. All that stuff it's all artistic. All my goals are artistic goals. I don't really have any career goals per se. I just don't want to turn out any kind of mediocre work. I don't want to half-ass anything. That is the thing that concerns me the most, is that it's very easy to do disposable work in comics. So there's a lot of pressure for you to do disposable work, and it can take a while for the audience to react poorly to that. So the immediate feedback isn't always there that you shouldn't be doing that. And I don't want to do that. I spent a lot of time on my comics. I spent a lot of time writing these comics, way more than maybe some people would say is healthy or worth it. But it's not about the money that you get from it or anything like that. It's about caring about the work. And I want to make sure in the future that I have enough space and time to care about the work. And I'm only taking on projects that I really care about and am excited by.
Well, I am very excited by everything you're doing. But Deniz, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Assorted Crisis Events, Ultimates, your career, and everything else. I really appreciate you taking the time.
This was a blast. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Deniz Camp. You can find him on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Instagram, and his work in Ultimates and the upcoming Absolute Martian Manhunter and Assorted Crisis Events. As per usual, big thanks to Deanna Chapman for editing this week's episode. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription site, Sketched, at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Blue Sky and Instagram or following me on Blue Sky and Instagram. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Comic Book Couples Counseling Podcast, Scott Carpenter, Gus, MK Freigeist, Sauntered, Brian, Chris Robinson, David Byrne, Milton Lawson, Joe, Benjamin Wilkins, Chris Hacker, John Neesmith, John Auerbach, Dustin Weaver, Brandon Heyman, Aiden Hammond, Faith Aaron Hicks, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polges, Tom Evans, Breed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian, Near Levy, Jason Hussad, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Dennis Hoffman, Jingo Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Klaus Vandeven, Submen Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePills, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Carino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Liana Kingus, Nick Bennett, Susanna Pola, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Robert Wilson IV, Andrew Carita, Stephen Hull, Philip Myra, Chris Pacella, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vieta Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, David Kelly, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.